So how do we make sure that every map that we create ultimately gives the impression and gives the message that we need our users and viewers to take away with them? So there are a couple of things that we can work on, and this is all about trying to define what we're trying to do in the first place. So the first thing is that you need to know who your target audience is that you're trying to reach. So we're talking about general public, is it a scientific audience, children, adult, etc. What is your take-home message? So what is the one thing that you want people to walk away with after they have looked at your map? How is the map going to be used? Is it something that's going to be stuffed into someone's back pocket? Is it going to be printed within a book or put up as a poster? What sort of data do you have to support the information that you are trying to convey? So this is a really critical one, because there's no point in trying to make a map if you don't have the data to support it. What is the size and shape of the main area of interest? So this is going to affect the way our maps are balanced. And are there any scale or projection requirements? So for example, we know that certain types of projections are really good for measuring area, while others are better for distance or looking at shape. So what are the requirements, and how does that relate to what it is that you're trying to achieve in the first place? What tools do you have for creating the map? So is it a pencil and paper job, or is it something that's going to be done within a GIS? What accuracy is required? And so this is always a really important one, that most people think that 100% accuracy is the best thing that you need to be striving to achieve, but that's not always realistic, and it's not always necessary either. You need to use intuitive symbology. So this is it's something that when people look at a map, the idea is that it's simplifying reality. So we don't want them to be challenged in terms of trying to understand what it is that you're trying to convey by making things confusing for them. So to summarize, it's all about keeping it simple, stupid. So let's have a look at purpose and accuracy. So when we look at this particular subway map, you might think that it definitely achieves its purpose. So you know how you can get from point A to point B on the subway. But the question is, how accurate is it? And could you measure distance on it, for example? Well, probably not. So you're not going to be able to measure distance, area, or even directions or angles or shapes. But the reality is that it achieves its purpose. So what accuracy is actually required? And then when we look at something like this that you might take from Google Earth or Google Maps, for example, so this is more cartographically correct, but it has completely different purpose. So when we consider these types of things, which of the two maps do you think would be best for explaining to people how they get from point A to point B on the rail line? So the first one more likely, but that is perhaps not as cartographically correct as the one on the right. So it's all about the purpose and the accuracy that you need to achieve. So perhaps you don't need to be quite so accurate on the rail map. How is your map going to be used? Is it going to be something that people walk all over, or are they going to put up on the wall, or is it a soft copy thing that is only ever going to be used within an app or on screen on a desktop? Does it need to be waterproof? Is it going to be used underwater, or is it going to be shoved in the back of someone's pocket? All of these things are really important when we consider how we create that map in the first place. And symbology is absolutely critical when we want to convey a message to people. So when we look at the following sequence of images of Queensland, see if you can think about what each of these is representing, and how do the colours affect what you consider the information to be presented as. And so what you might think is, up on the upper left one, the first image in the sequence, you might start to think, oh, well, perhaps, it's some type of land cover, because these boundaries between these colours are very, very distinct. There's these hard lines between perhaps something that might be vegetation and something that might be agricultural areas or something. Now, the next one in the sequence, what do you think of with that? Is that something that perhaps makes you think something to do with the topography of the landscape? And maybe even the third one that looks something like temperature. But the trick here is that all 4 of these images are actually the exact same information, but all I've done is to display them with a different color in different ways. So all 4 of these actually show the elevation of Queensland, but they are colored in ways that that's designed to confuse you. And this is to prove the point that what you actually want to do when you create a map is do exactly the opposite of what I have just done. So you want to do something where people who are viewing your map automatically feel like they're familiar with the information, and it's giving them some intuitive knowledge. So elevation isn't one that's really well presented, like the top left, for example, and the top right. You definitely think temperature rather than elevation there as well. And so you need to be thinking also about the type of data set that you have. So is it discrete and thematic, so where you have these hard boundaries between different categories, or is it continuous? So land cover or land use, where you have forest, water, grasses, etc. Are these discrete or thematic classes that we have within our data? And a continuous data set might be something more like elevation or rainfall, where it does cover the complete surface and there's always a gradation between the values. If there are any standard conventions with the data set that you're using, it's a really good idea to use them. So there's no need to reinvent unless you're sure that what you're going to create is something that's going to be better than that which is already generally accepted. So we think about these information types. We have thematic maps and discrete data. So these are the ones with these really hard boundaries between the different classes, and comparing that to continuous data sets. And so they're going to be displayed differently when you create your map. So continuous data works really well with ramped colors. So for example, a gray scale of shading, whereas thematic maps work really well with those hard boundaries. We're going to think about that intuitive type data though. So when we think about thematic maps, if we have vegetation and water, for example, make sure that the vegetation is green and the water is blue, and these are colors that people already relate to. So we consider size, shape and balance. So I've just used 2 examples here of New Zealand, which is a very long and skinny type map, whereas Heron Reef, on the other hand, goes the other way. So this affects the way we put our different elements on the map as well. So New Zealand works in a more portrait style, whereas Heron works better in a landscape style. And then you can, particularly with New Zealand, you've got a lot of wasted space around there that you can start to put your other elements in, like your legend and your North Arrow, etc. And a key thing to remember is that less is actually more. So we don't want to clutter our maps with everything just because we have everything available to us. And if you have a look at Google Maps, it's a really good example of how they work with the less is more concept. So as you zoom out on Google Earth or Google Maps, you will see the information becoming more and more simplified. And so at this scale that I've presented here, for example, you've got your main capital cities and you've got your state names. Whereas if I was to zoom all the way in, you start to see more and more information appear, but it only appears when the scale is right for that to happen. So let's look at some of these critical map elements. So these are all the sorts of things that you must have on a map. And so it's a really good checklist to have to make sure that you have these items. So we do need to have a title. It gives people information about what we're looking at. The exception to this is if it's in a scientific paper, because you'll have a figure caption at the bottom. We can have insets, so they may be providing contextual information in the broader region, or they may be zoomed in components as well. But just make sure that when you pop on your scale bar that you do so for all the elements of your map. So if you've got the zoomed in element, that it's going to have a different scale bar to the one with the bigger picture there. We always have a north arrow to make sure people know which way the map is oriented, and also a legend or a key so people know what the different colors and symbols on the map represent. We want to have labels in some instances. This helps with contextual information, but just making sure that they're not cluttering the space. And of course, we've got our actual data that exists in the map as well. And finally, we want to make sure that we get all this metadata information that's required. So the author, any copyright information, projection, datum, coordinate systems, and of course, where those data sources have come from and the date that they were derived or sourced as well. So looking a little bit more about scale. So you may already be familiar with a couple of different types of scale scale notification. So we've got a scale by here, this black and white checker one, which is it's really, really commonly used. And then we have a representative fraction, and we also have a ratio. And finally, we have the option to write this in text. So for example, 1 centimeters on the ground equals 1 kilometer on the ground. And these are all valid ways of displaying scale on your maps. And many maps use more than one form of this as well. But a question is to think about this as, what would you consider to be large scale or small scale? And this is a term that I think is really, really ambiguous and often incorrectly used. So let's have a look at the left image versus the right image, excuse me, there. So when we consider that scale is a fraction, for example, 1 over 25,000 or 1 over a million, therefore, large or small scale actually refers to the size of the fraction, not the size of the denominator. So for example, a low detail large area map, like the one on the left, might be 1:250,000 or 1:1,000,000. So it looks like a really, really large number because that denominator is large, but the fraction itself is actually really, really small. But by contrast, a high detail small area map, so maybe one around Cairns for example, might be done at 1:5,000 or 1:10 or 1:25,000 or so. And while it looks like that number is smaller because the denominator is smaller, as a fraction as a whole, it is actually a larger number. So there we go, we have the map on the left hand side of all of Australia is small scale, and the one on the right of Cairns is actually a large scale. Now realize this can actually be counterintuitive to many people, considering that this information has been incorrectly conveyed to most people probably for all of their lives. So a way that we can get around this confusion is to not use the terms large or small scale given its ambiguity, and look at broad scale or large area or fine scale or small area as well. So you can talk about you doing a broad area study or a continental scale study or something like that, but just try and steer away from large and small scale. So a task for you is to think about how you would improve this particular map. There's lots and lots of things that could be done better, and so I want you to think about how you would do it better and what changes you would make.